such a way that the specification or the tolerance limits are more than natural process limits. Got this one? And whereas the control limits are much smaller than the process limits. So the control limits are much smaller than the tolerance limits or the specifications limits. So what we are trying to compare with the process with the control limits. So even if I stop, it goes out of control there. Actually, the defective items are not produced. That is the beauty of that. Okay, but I want this one that it is economically viable. Now try to think this one. The control limits, how they are placed? Based on how much distance it should be away from the central line. Central line means mean line. In case of control charts for variables, X bar chart, X double bar is the mean. And for R chart, R bar is the mean. In sigma chart, sigma bar is the mean. Whereas in case of P chart, P bar is the mean value. NP chart, NP bar is the mean value. And in case of C chart, C bar is the mean value. And in case of U chart, U bar is the mean value. Okay, I think I'll stop at this point. Next class, we'll further discuss about these things. Okay, thank you. Good day.
Good morning, everyone. Today I will be discussing on methods of data collection, which is an important chapter under research methodology. We all know that any research activity will be conducted with a source of information that is available. When I say information, information is something useful that can be used by any researcher or an author in compiling and proposing his concepts and broaden the areas of analysis. Whereas when I talk about data, data is basically a raw data. It may be facts, it may be findings, it may be publishing, or it may be a summary, it may be a manual, or it may be a series of instructions, or it may be a observations. Thus, data overall is an important aspect of any research process. Thus, the task of data collection begins with understanding the research problem itself. Here, when I talk about research design or sampling design, as well as different measurement tools and scaling techniques, data also come into existence. When we have ample amount of sources available, we need to identify particular data that is required for a specific research activity. Thus, we need to keep in mind the two types of information that is available with respect to the data. What type of data are we going to collect? Usually, collection of data is a huge task and it requires lot of repetitions, lot of corrections, or lot of expert opinions with respect to the type of data that we are collecting. Along with that, the collection methods need to be understood. Thus, in any research activity, though we have data, the question arises is how are we going to collect the data? This is very important. What type of data are we going to collect? When are we going to collect? Whom are we supposed to approach? And where are we going to reach through this data collection process? So all these questions need to be answered when I talk about methods of data collection. Basically, how the data collection is considered and what type of data are we going to use. So it depends on the researcher whether he is going through any statistical process or whether he is going through any certain sort of framework that he has prepared for method of data collection. Researchers should keep in mind two types of data that is available. One is primary data and secondary data. It depends on the researcher now whether he is going through a process of primary data collection method or a secondary data collection method. And also data is available in two forms. Now here the overall content of this method of data collection includes collection of primary data, collection of secondary data, the different methods that are available, and other methods of data collection like distributors, pantry audits, or it can be certain mechanical devices or instruments that we are going to use, or it is projective techniques, and also whether the case study or a survey method are suitable for a specific data collection technique. Thus, all these will be covered with respect to methods of data collection in today's class or in further classes. Then, here primary data collected are the data that is used or being collected for the first time. Whereas secondary data is available in a published format. So this is the difference between the primary data and the secondary data that exists. Hence, primary data are those are collected fresh and for the first time. It happens to be original in character and someone else has not yet attempted in collecting the data. Whereas when I talk about the secondary data on the other hand is already collected by someone. It is in some format that is available and it is a data that is sorted with respect to a particular situation and here may be going through a certain statistical process which has been published. Thus, data for a researcher is something like this. He needs to understand what type of data should be picked up from each of the sources. So, it depends on the researcher in sorting out the data from the different methods, whether it is originally collected or it is secondary data collection. Now we will focus on what is meant by primary sources of data and how do I go for collection of primary data. In the previous classes I have discussed the various primary data that is available and the different sources of data. Today I will be discussing more on the collection of primary data. Now here, this is in general that I am explaining today. If there are surveys or experiments that we are conducting, then the possible relationship with the data and unknown universe will be there are three types of data that can be collected here. With respect to experiments, experiments is what we determine. Surveys is what is being studied through. So I can write here what is being studied through. This is the difference that you people need to understand with respect to surveys or experiments. Then the possible relationship here is with respect to economic, physiological aspects, or it can be psychological aspects and others. So this is the basic relationship and economic factors that exist in both the cases. Now when I talk about collection of primary data, here the data can be collected using a course of doing some experiments, or it can be certain research. If it is experiment, then it becomes an experimental research, but if it is in descriptive type of research, then we can go for some simple sample survey methods in order to collect the primary data. That is why I took these examples as experiments that we are determining in an original form using some measuring device, whereas survey we are studying what has been happened, and this is especially used for descriptive type of research or explorative type of research. Thus, along with this survey, certain census can be conducted, or it can be through certain observation. It can be through direct communication from the respondents in one form or the other form, or certain personal interviews can be conducted. So in other words, what do we mean by collecting primary data is, the data usually it is in the form of certain surveys or in certain questionnaires in a descriptive format. The important ones under the collection of primary data are, I will just list it out here so that it will be useful for you people in understanding how do I collect the primary data, because it's one of the important questions that a researcher has to answer before going for any experimental techniques, use of research design, then based on the sample that is available, how many, what else should be the size of the sample. All these are answered through this question. So here, under primary, collecting the primary data, the first method can be observation method. Second method includes here is interview method. These are very important methods if a person is doing any descriptive research. Then third here is going through questionnaires, and many of the researchers should start with these type of methods so that in the beginning the primary data will give the originality to a research activity that has been conducted. So it can be through questionnaires or through schedules. Then other methods that include, we will take upon the other methods later on. Let us focus on the observation method. When I talk about observation method, directly we know the meaning of observation. But how do we imply it on collecting the data here? Observation can be certain behavior, it can be certain attitude, and it can be sort of observation which may not be in a scientific manner, but also it becomes a scientific tool when we are judging or when we are collecting the data. And here a researcher can go for certain formulated research purpose which can be systematically planned, which can be systematically recorded, which can be which can have a certain checks and controls, or he even can validate and prove through the observations or through some method wherein this observation method can be fruitful in analyzing the data. Thus, under observation method, the investigator's own observation is possible, and here direct observation by asking or without asking the respondent is also possible. And for the instance relating to the consumer behavior especially, the investigator can, instead of asking the brand, he can ask for what type of wristwatch he is using. So this is, or he may just look at the watch by himself and one will come to know that what type of brand it is. So investigations can be done much easier with respect to this. The main advantage of this method is the subjective bias is eliminated because the responses are being obtained by the investigator himself, and it can be observations can be recorded since it is pre-planned and recorded, or it is in a formulated manner, hence it can be accurate. Then the other aspect of this method is currently what is happening can be recorded immediately. It is not a complicated manner. Then also the past behaviors or intentions or attitudes will not affect the observation because what actually is happening can be understood. And the third important is independent, it is independent of the respondent. This is another, because there may be variation from one respondent to another respondent with respect to the objective or the object that we have stated. Thus, this happens to be one of the best methods than any other questionnaire method because it is suitable for various subjects in the beginning, and here there are no certain verbal feelings that get attached or any reasoning that has to be done. Thus, observation method is one of the basic methods used by many researchers before starting the research activity or a research process, or during the research process. This observation can be included in cases like understanding consumer behavior, understanding the practicality of the situation that exists, or it is preferences that one can give by the respondents. All these are the basic advantages of the observation method. But the other part is, though it is an inexpensive, though it is an investigator's best tool, it is one of the expensive method because we need to provide a conducive environment to understand the observations. And here the investigator should be very shrewd enough in identifying the change in behaviors of the consumers, the change in behaviors of the respondents as and when the situation is being changed. Sometimes it may get affected by certain unforeseen factors or that may create certain obstacle in understanding the data or collecting the data. Thus, while using this method, he should keep in mind certain questions. What should be observed? This is a basic question the observer or an investigator should understand or a researcher should understand. Then, the next question is how to observe and what should be recorded. As I posed the questions earlier as well, what data collection should be done. Similarly, under the observation method, what observations should be recorded? Not all observations are recorded. That may not be required for a researcher. So what observation should be recorded? The accuracy of observation should be ensured, and the characteristics of defining the observations need to be understood. The style of recording the information also should not affect the respondents, and sometimes it may have to be kept very secret, in a secret manner, so that the actual behavior should not be revealed of the respondents. So such things should be kept in mind. That is a standardization of the observation method or the environment that a researcher is providing should be formulated in a better manner. Then, the selection of pertinent data of observation is also very important. So all this becomes standardized conditions, then selection of pertinent data for observation. This becomes a structured observation method. But when the data of observation is taking place in advance and some are tend to happen, then we have to go for certain unstructured observation methods. Structured observation is usually considered for descriptive studies, exploratory studies, and more likely, whereas in observational procedure, sometimes relatively unstructured are not used. We often talk about a participant and a non-participant type observation techniques. This is very important here. We can have participant and non-participant observation technique. So if participant himself is also into a certain observation room, then it becomes a participation technique. If he is not a part of the observation or a data collection, then it becomes a non-participant observation. But the other important thing lies in difference between these two is, if he is a part of that group, there are several merits. The researcher is enabled to record the natural behavior. The researcher can gather the required information, and that could not be easily understood if he is not an observer. Certain in disinterested fashion also he can identify. Then the researcher can even verify the truth of statements that exactly lie by the informants in that context of observation. But the other problem associated with this is, it takes lot of time. It becomes very time consuming. Thus, the non-observation techniques non-participate techniques are usually used. That because in his absence also some observation is being recorded. Sometimes we can go for controlled as well as non-controlled observation. When I talk about controlled and non-controlled observations, it may be because of the various factors or natural setting that takes place in case of controlled environment. Controlled atmosphere or pre-planned sessions or pre-planned experimental procedures can be added. Then it becomes a controlled observation. Whereas in non-controlled observation, there is no attempt made for precision instruments, and spontaneous picture of life for a people or any such situations can act as a non-controlled atmosphere. But sometimes here it becomes difficult to identify the accuracy and standardization of the process. So such observations has a tendency to supply certain unedited data or formalized data upon which the researcher's stand takes place. So there is also a danger of having a feeling of that we know more about the observed phenomena than anybody else. So such things should be avoided. Thus, when we talk about laboratory or uncontrolled situations, then we have to go for more a type of exploratory type of research under this. Then coming to the next type of observation through which we are going to collect the primary data. We know that observation is simple to studies relating to the behavioral science, where the actual situation is taken and the observation is carried out. But in case of interview method, it is posing certain questions and getting the answers, as simple as I told now. But it may not be so. Then when we talk about any research activity, then collecting data here involves presentation of oral and verbal both, and also the reply in terms of oral and verbal both. So this is a part of interview method, and this method is used through personal interviews, through telephonic interviews, and structured or unstructured interviews that will be going in detail. But hence we are talking about interview method. It has to be formatted in a proper manner, and the frame of conducting an interview sessions whether it is formal, non-formal, personal interview, non-personal interview, telephonic, needs to be in a structured manner. Otherwise, the purpose of collecting data may be lost, or the focus of identifying or collecting the data may be lost. So researcher needs to be pretty careful if he is taking up an interview method as a collection of primary data. Under interview method, as I said, it involves presentation of oral and verbal, as well as the reply will be in the form of oral and verbal. If we consider one of the methods under personal interview, so now I am talking about interview method, and if we take the first one as personal interview. As you all know, the importance of personal interview that is being taken during any campus interview or any other interview for job preferences and all. Then similarly here, for the research, a personal interview method requires an interviewer who asks the questions and the respondent who provides the answers. And there may be face-to-face contact. If it is a personal interview, there generally will be face-to-face contact. Unlike observation method, wherein only the observing the situation has been done. At times, the interviewee may also ask certain questions to the interviewer, depends on the response, but usually the interviewer initiates the questions and the respondent will answer. Here both it can be oral as well as verbal aspect. So this sort of interview may form a direct personal investigation. So if it is face to face, then it becomes a direct personal investigation. Why do we talk about investigation? Because in certain cases, directly the person concerned with the situation is been accounted for and extensive scope of inquiry is available for the researcher. Thus, we term it as direct investigation technique. Okay, and in case of indirect oral examination, usually the interviewer will just cross-examine the information, that person who is supposed to have that knowledge of information, and also sometimes if he gets the answers or the responses in a proper manner, then he will record it. And most of the commissions or government authorities, many a times they go for indirect type of interview method because of the time lapses that exist, or because of the economy that may restrict, or because of the stability in the structure, they may go for a non-direct method of interviewing. But other things, when I talk about conducting and collecting of the data with respect to primary data, we need to talk about structured interview and unstructured interview. So we will go through details with respect to structured and unstructured interview. When I talk about structured interview, this is one of the important methods for collecting the primary data. It is usually carried out in a structured way, and here there are predetermined set of questions the interviewer will ask, and it is highly standardized technique for recording the responses. Immediately the responses will get recorded. So nowadays we have all online set of questions that are available and that can be laid down by an interviewer while calculating or while collecting the data. Thus, in an unstructured interview, it is usually characterized with flexibility with which the interviewer can ask. The approach of listening will be much higher than posing the questions, and the interviewer will not follow the set of questions, and there may be no standard recording techniques as well. Thus, he must be very careful and he should have a skill of posing the questions in case of non-structured interview. In a non-structured interview also, the interviewer is allowed at a greater freedom to ask the required questions, the supplementary questions, as well as he may omit certain questions that may not be necessary with respect to the respondent. Then in that case, he may even change the sequence in an unstructured interview. He has a greater freedom and flexibility of understanding the responses from the person, but this sort of flexibility will lack the comparability with the structured interview. Sometimes it becomes more time consuming, it is very difficult in understanding the responses, the actual responses that we were supposed to, that we had predicted may not be available, and also these unstructured interview, which the interviewer should have deep knowledge of that subject and greater skill in taking part in asking the questions. And this may be helpful. Usually this technique usually is used in exploratory or formative type of research. Then if we are more concerned with respect to economics or providing safe basis or generalization, then we can go for structured type of interview where less skill is available by the interviewer. Then also we can sometimes talk about focused interview, clinical interview or non-directive interview and so on. If we are talking about focused interview, the subject matter has been focused with respect to the questions that is asked by an interviewer. When we talk about clinical interview, it is basically with respect to the emotions or the feelings or simply encouragement of the respondents is being done, and then the information is being collected. Sometimes there may be bias also with respect to clinical type of interview. If it is non-directive interview, then the interviewer's function is to simply encourage and ask the interviewees to speak about his life experience and then gather the knowledge. So this is with respect to the different forms or types of interview that are available. Then here we need to understand where to and when to use this type of interviews that I just spoke about. Maybe structured, unstructured, direct, non-directive, formulative or non-formulative. Then these type of interviews that are conducted have certain weaknesses or advantages. Just going to the merits of this type of interview, I can say that more amount of information can be available when we talk about face-to-face contact, and greater in-depth questions can be asked to generate the primary data. Interviewer can use his own skill of asking the questions, and he can overcome the resistance with which we can collect the data from the direct source of information that is available. It is perfectly simple and it can be used for any general type of population. Then there exists a greater flexibility, and this method has the opportunity to restructure the questions whenever required, and then going for unstructured interview. The observation method can as well be employed by verbal answers to the various questions. Then personal information can be eliminated so that one can have easy information. Then samples can be controlled more effectively, than arises no difficulty of minimizing the returns. The interviewer usually will control which persons will answer which type of questions. That can also happen in questionnaire type aspects. Then interviewer may catch the informant off guard and can secure the spontaneous reactions through the observation techniques. The language of interview can be adopted that is more suitable, available and ability for all types of educational levels, because he can avoid certain misinterpretations in the questions that has been asked, and also along with the required data, certain supplementary data also can be noted through the interview method, because the respondents may talk about his personal characteristics, environment, likes, dislikes, often interpreting the results. But certain disadvantage of this interview technique is it is sometimes very expensive method, because personally every time the interviewer should go to a respondent and pose the questions. Sometimes the interviewer may be having lot of time, but the interviewee or the respondent may not have that amount of time to respond and to provide the responses required, and the respondents may be widely spread. Thus, it becomes a very expensive method. Then, the possibility of bias usually exists because it is always that what is expected by the interviewer is such type of questions are asked. Then, sometimes executives of high income groups may not be easily approachable for collecting the data. Then, this method, as I said, it is more time consuming, and if the sample is large, it will take a lot of time, and sometimes the respondent recalls upon the respondents may be necessary many a times in collecting the primary data, and also the presence of interviewer on the spot over stimuli to respond is very difficult. Sometimes it becomes imaginary as well. Thus, under this method, certain selection, training, and supervising is required so that the researcher can has to formulate various questions to be asked. Thus, valid whether it is viable or no needs to be decided first in whether we can go for interview method or no. Then interviewing sometimes also may introduce certain systematic errors in the entire research process. Effective interview presupposes the proper rapport between the respondents, so that also may hamper. Sometimes it is free and frank responses will hinder the relationship between the respondent and the interviewer. So that is why it becomes a difficult treatment when we go in. Thus, before going into any interview process, the basic prerequisites need to be understood by the interviewer. Here the basic prerequisite is proper training, carefulness, then briefed. He should be briefed about the interview or the respondent properly. Honest, sincere responses should be recorded, and he should possess that technical competence while questioning the respondents. He should never cheat or not deviate with the questions, and occasionally certain field checks should be done properly, and he should also the schedule of these interviews should be properly made so that in advance the respondents should be asked for conducting the interviews, and also selection of the respondents is again a big question here. Whether they will refuse, they will cooperate, or they are that capable in that skilled in answering the question, that also need to be understood. Thus, interviewing is not only for collecting primary data, it is an art of getting the certain information, and sometimes usually governed by scientific principles. Here, effort should be made while conducting the interview very friendly, the atmosphere of trust and confidence. Generally, we get the responses in a proper manner. And respondents must feel ease in giving the answers, in discussing the answers, or else it will hamper the entire or hinder the entire interview process. And the data collection may not be that appropriate. That is why it may result in systematic bias. Interviewer must ask questions properly, intelligently, and must record the responses accurately in a proper manner. Also, at the same time, the legitimate questions should be asked. There should not be any ambiguity in the minds of respondents. And sometimes the surprise question should not be there, so that it will lead to certain disapproval by the respondents. Thus, the interviewer should act friendly, courteous, and conversation should be appropriate. It should be unbiased, and also he must keep the direction of interview in line with getting the responses and collecting the data. And irrelevant correlations between any form of subject area should not be done. Otherwise, it will result in ambiguity in understanding the questions. And also keep the respondents in track in answering the questions. So this is with respect to the personal interview. Then when I talk about telephonic interview under this, if it is telephonic interview, then we all know that we need to prior take the permission at what time or at what juncture the telephonic interview will be conducted. Contacting the respondents at proper schedule must be set, and usually it is not a very widely used method because face-to-face contact will provide better information. Otherwise, especially it plays an important part when we talk about industrial surveys or developed region, then the merits of the system are more flexible, mailing of information will be very quick, more cheaper technique, and unnecessary time is not lost in answering the questions. Immediate responses are available, and then the replies are recorded in a formatted manner and without causing any embarrassment to the respondents. It is a quick way of obtaining the information, as well as the access to information will be much easier, and the interviewer can explain the respondents in a more better manner than face to face sometimes, and there is no field staff required to go to a respondent and then collect the information. Then representation and wider distribution of sample may be available than in case of the personal interview method. But the other demerits of this telephonic system is, or telephonic interview is, little time is used by the respondents to answer, and it may not likely happen, and it may not even exceed 5 minutes or 2 minutes in some cases, and surveys gets restricted only to certain restricted respondents who are available at that juncture of time, and then surveys are restricted those who have certain telephonic facilities or those who have facilities, computing facilities, who can provide the data. Then extensive geographical area cannot be covered. Sometimes it may get restricted because of cost considerations. Also the infrastructure may not be available, and it is suitable where we can go for only sample responses. But when we go for certain comprehensive answers, then face-to-face interviews are much better. And also there is possibility of bias or manipulation that may happen in case of personal telephonic interviews. And also other part is it is very short, it is point to point, and sometimes the data is very difficult to handle. So these are the problems that get posed with respect to telephonic interview than the personal interview. So these are the two methods that we have discussed today, that is observation method and interview method. Next class I will be dealing with data collection through questionnaires, where the type of questions, the form of questions, the difference between the questionnaires and schedules, and the collection of data through schedules, then secondary data collection of the secondary data, then what is the appropriate method, and how do I understand that selection of appropriate method. Then along with that, certain case study methods, guidelines for conducting a successful interviewing, then all these will be discussed and covered in the next class. So this is the part of information that I will be dealing in the next class.